just to put it back. Keep talking.
Keep talking.
That's all right.
Just tell us, thumbs up when it's better. Keep talking. Check 1, 2, 3. Just talk like a mouse. Talk like a mouse. 1, 2, 3.
That's good. That's pretty right.
That's better. I can hear it myself. And particularly David, our Vice President and past President. Great to see you, David, after your big operation. That's fantastic. Young Will didn't get a biscuit this morning. He's been naughty. But he was in good company. I didn't get one either. I've recently come back from an overseas trip, and some, if not all of you, have been overseas at some stage. Pardon me, you know, it's like trying to get back into a circadian rhythm, and I haven't been able to do that. Been waking up at 3 o'clock, so last night I scattered around with my late wife Marie. I found one of her sleeping tablets, and thought one won't hurt. Gee, it worked a treat. I woke up this morning and I thought, oh, I better get out of bed. Hit the line, the drawers closed over. I thought, oh, I'll see what the time is. Got out, walked into the kitchen. Yikes! 10:05. So what do? I ring David Jones and tell him I'm going to be late. Anyway, I've never been in the army, but I reckon I had a Tommy shower and I had a piece of toast and a cup of tea on the way here. So that's why I can't see the bell. My eyes are just starting to open. Do we have any apologies today?
Yes, we do.
Peter Bedford.
Peter Bedford, thank you.
Okay.
David Lund, thanks.
Yep. Laurie Rose.
Laurie Rose.
Peter McCartney is at the doctor. Laurie Rose is on the Murray River. And Ian Williamson is a bit crook.
Right. And David? Pardon?
Len Edwards.
Len, good. Great, thank you. Do we have any guests today? Doesn't look like it.
Bev Ratton.
Oh, Bev Ratton, of course. Hi, Bev. Please make her welcome. Where are we? November. Any November babies? November birthdays? John Metcalf. What date, John?
24th.
Wonderful. Rebecca?
Yeah, one young fellow over here, the 5th of November.
Oh, young Will?
Bill, he's just 101 now.
101. Yeah, you raised your bat last year and waved to the crowd. Anybody else? No, okay. Special occasions, anniversaries. Got your leaving certificate, matriculated, went back to uni. I don't think we've got any inductions today, so we've got a roll call today. David, is that you, me?
We just want to do a count. We're just going to do a count.
I've got the list. Nick, have you got the list?
Just do a count, it's easier.
Nick's got the list.
I can go through them.
All right.
Yeah?
I think it's a Karen. Maybe it's not.
We were going to save time and just do a head count.
Head count.
Just do a head count would be cool.
Okay. Anybody good with maths? Yeah?
I'll do a head count for you.
Right.
I'll do it for you.
What language is that?
23, which is near the mean.
Okay. Thanks, Colin. Reports while you're on your feet.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You'll hear about, with the members' corner, the trip to the MCG, but I've got 3 Chanteliers here. One of them is Red Jackson, and it's titled Why We Sing, a very program of choral and solo music. The Melbourne Singers Annual Concert, Sunday, 7th November 2024 at 2:30 p.m. And whereabouts is this going to be? Where is that going to be?
It's the MLC auditorium in Kew, Marcus Road, Kew. And there's a QR code on that so you can pay now.
Okay, I'll stick it up on the table up here. And also we have Immortal Beethoven, conducted by Peter Bandy, a famous man. He's got famous singers as well. We know one here. Anyway, this is at Heidelberg Choral Society. It's going to be
1st of December.
1st of December.
1st of December. At the Performing Arts Centre, Ivanhoe Girls Grammar School. Only concession, $55.
You
And-
will be doing the Ode to Joy, which a lot of
Okay.
people will know that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beethoven song.
That's fantastic.
Are you singing, Bev?
Oh, yeah.
I'll put some flyers up the back.
Yep. And things come in threes. We've got our master singer? We haven't had master singers, did we? Anyway, we've got Kevin doing a master singing with his group on December 3, between 1 and 3, Rosanna Uniting Church before it gets pulled down. So that should be fantastic.
Just community.
Yeah, asbestos.
Fine, yeah, it's best the thing.
It's free.
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 Oh, wow. Here we are. That's a real incentive. Okay, that's my news of the day.
Thank you. While we're talking about Kevin, Mr. Treasurer.
Okay, well, at the moment, we've got $2,333 in the bank. However, before today, received a few payments. $770 worth of that was for Christmas lunch. Today, I've received a few more payments for our Christmas lunch, but there's still a few payments needed from a few people who are going to the lunch. It's $55, and still about 10 of us still paying.
Yep.
That's
Thanks, Kevin. Brian. No.
Three of our members have had a scuffle with the surgeons in the last month. One of them being David, of course, who's made a brilliant recovery from his hip replacement. Len Edwards, who's unfortunately not here, has had a pacemaker. He was hoping that he would be over that and better and able to come with him. So, and David Lunn is at this moment, or today anyhow, having a lesion removed from his right hand, which will require a skin graft. He's just finished getting over a skin graft on his foot. So he's moved from Epworth, where that was done, to Warringal, where this is to be done. So he's working his way through the hospitals in Melbourne. The one thing that's concerning him is that he's not quite sure how he's going to be able to get the top off that stubby. I've spoken with a few of our mobility challenged people, but they seem to be maintaining the status quo. That's people like Ron Speechley and who's the other? John Horsfall and somebody else, but I've spoken with them. That's all, thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
I could say while I'm up, something about the lunch at Delara, which you all know is where it is. It's out on the Eltham, through Eltham, Main Road, Eltham. Nice place. I'd suggest that people get there about 11:30. You can drop people who are handicapped a bit in moving around can be dropped off at the front door, but the actual parking area for cars is about maybe 100 metres away, so you can drop off the cripples and then go and park your car.
Good idea.
Then when you go in, there'll be a board or papers or something that will tell you which table you're on, because the seating's been arranged. So you have a look for your name, find out which of the 10 tables you'll be at. There's about 100 people going all together, so we've got 10 tables of 10 in round figures, and then we should have a terrific day, as usual. Thank you.
Brian, could you let David Lund know there'll be enough people there to help him rip the top off his stubby?
Yeah, I have actually spoken to him about that.
Won't be a problem.
I suggested some other ways of getting the top of the
Seriously,
Yeah, that's right. If you want it badly enough, use your teeth and you can't see Peter Bedford. All right, okay. Enough of the shenanigans. Members' Corner.
Oh yeah, that's me.
That is you. We'll just have a little change over here, so I think put this back on here. That's for Uncle Will.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Put that down my pants. Right.
You'll be happy.
Yeah, I will be. Very good. Oops. Yeah, okay, I can hear that. Let's get out of this. Just a second.
Move in there. Thank
What
you.
is it?
Okay, just one second to get this. No. Just give me that. Progress. Nothing's private in this world, is it? No, that's true. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
I'll just put... We went to the MCG, which is really quite an extraordinary place. And that's a view of it, and you can appreciate that it's a most established and beautiful building with a lot of Melbourne in the background, and it's really a centre of transport. Obviously this goes out to Richmond, and this up here goes out to Hurst Bridge. So a well-located sports and entertainment venue. It comprises a number of things, but that's the turf area that's interesting in itself. And there's a bit of turf technology here. This is a drop-in pitch. And they have these big Caterpillar trucks that come in with about a layer of turf that's nearly, oh I don't know, it's about 0.5 metres thick. So it comes in with big Caterpillar wheels and just drops it in, and you have a game of cricket within a day or so. Most extraordinary. All this grass gets repaired every now and again. When the latest sort of superstar came and there was seating here, it was re-turfed. It probably means that there's no worms in here because all the grass has been gotten from outside. It probably means its bacteriology is low, but it's certainly grass and it's growing. On the outside you can just see here synthetic grass. I don't know whether that's to make it better so you don't crash into the fence when you're playing footy or whatever. Whilst we're here, the fence itself is not wood pickets, but it's a synthetic, slightly flexible material. So when you crash into it, you don't hurt yourself so much and you can't impale yourself on the top. So the surface itself is rather extraordinary. Now, on the MCG tour, what we came to appreciate, it's more than just a sports ground, it's a complex building that does lots and lots of different things. And if you look at it, the MCC that administers it started in 1838 with about 5 people. Now there are 62,653 members and 180,000 people on the waiting list. So it's quite extraordinary. It has the long room that's sort of most sacred spot, and it has 23,000 members at seating reserved. That's quite impressive. You'll see these pictures as we go along, but the volunteers who took us around are senior members of the MCC and extremely well trained. They did an excellent job. Now the MCG, which is different, is the Melbourne Cricket Ground. In its current state, started in 1853 and it was a gift of land granted by the Lieutenant Governor Latrobe. The Victorian Government owns it via the MCG Trust and it's managed by the Melbourne Cricket Club. That's its structure and accommodates roughly 100,000 people in a seating. Its budget, this is from the 2023 figures, its revenue, annual revenue is about 7.2 million, and of that $2 million in 23 came as a government grant for future development, and its asset register is about 499 million. I thought it might be more than that. I don't know how they quite costed it. The thing about the MCG, when you look at it, its infrastructure has many facets. It's lots of bars and all sorts of things, and it's all exquisitely maintained. So the maintenance of it is really a triumph. I've discussed the grass technology, and that's a big deal for them all, and it's really world class, but it's special sort of grass and not what you'll see outside. The player facilities, obviously the players have to go there, get changed, all that sort of stuff, but what you particularly notice is that it's moderately sterile in there, except for the honour boards that have all the great performances of the past. And I'll just show you examples of that later. Its library is open to all people, but you can't, unless you're a member, you can't borrow the books, but you can go in there and look at their library if you wish. And that's over 100 years old. Also has a sports museum in mementos area and demonstrations around the facility. So it's really a multi-functional arena. Okay, you see lots of things as you walk in, and this just commemorates when the group of five first started the ball rolling in 1838. That's about, what, 3 years into Melbourne's history, at least with European habitation, if you discount the whalers. Okay, this is the, I've forgotten his name. Do you remember his name at all, Reg? Do you remember our guide's name? Anyway, don't matter.
Give me 10 minutes.
Okay, all right, tell us at the end. Anyway, they all come dressed in this garb, and he's 85 years old and did an absolutely excellent job, and they're all brilliantly trained. So they had very good training, and as volunteers, they're just really outstanding.
Bruce.
Bruce, thank you. That was less than 10 minutes.
Yes.
You've actually passed the dementia test there. That's very good. Okay, so here we go. This is what it looked like in 1895. So you can see that even at this stage, it was a very well established, the test cricket match between Australia and England. You can see it's a very well established ground. You can see the crowd pretty well dressed, and it's got some stands and things like that. Obviously, there's venues around there, or sites around there that just have spectacular views of Melbourne and the central portions. Here's one example of the honour board you get in the player change area. So you go into the player change area, this is where they go for test matches, footy and all that sort of stuff. So you have free reign of seeing all the really central bits in this facility. So here it is. This is those who have taken 5 wickets in test performances for Australia, and here's Shane Warne who took the last hat trick. So these things are dotted up around the place. It's fairly sterile, but they have special player areas where they sit down on sort of series of benches where the computer screens are there and they discuss how to beat Gary Ablett or what you've got to do. It doesn't look like the Fitzroy Stadium at the footy ground. It's really rather plush in a lot of the areas, and you can see it's really pristine, no mess, everything's just first class. And obviously lots of bars. This is a blazer bar if you've got a bit more dough. This is where you have it if you're a snag, and so on. They very much value the time that the MCG was the main venue for the Commonwealth Games and the Olympic Games. And around the place, it has various things like this. This is the longest leap string, the hop, step and jump. And you can see where they start and where they finished and so on. That's really a very interesting aspect of what's going on. I'll go back one. You put the rubbish in here. No, put rubbish in here. It's got rubbish and mailboxes and all sorts of things around there, like a supermarket or a town hall or whatever. This is just a little bit about the library. It started in 1873. It's got the Melbourne Cricket Ground insignia, or Cricket Club insignia. Here's the chief librarian, lots of books. There's a big reading area around here, and here we are queuing up, hearing what she's got to say. But she was a nice lady, and it's a really good collection. Then the museum, and there's a lot of stuff to look at. This was a centenary cricket bat, and everyone signed it, and there's all this sort of stuff around the place, but all sports, not just footy and cricket, everything's there. And they have various heroes, and here's some relief sculpturing of them. And here's a picture of Don Bradman. It's always interesting to see how they go about their cricket. His hands are fairly close together, and anyway, he did a good job with that. As part of the history, this wasn't the MCG, but I think this was in North Melbourne, and it's a special pavilion where they actually reversed the seats. There's a footy ground or some sort of sports ground to the right and then one to the left, and if you wanted to sit on the right, the seats were posted in that manner. If you wanted to sit on the one to the left, it was posted the other way. And that was rather ingenious and interesting, but it burned down. We couldn't get into the long room, but this is their Holy of Holies, where they have all sorts of pictures and functions and so on. I think there were a number of important people there, more important than us, so we can go in. Now, look, this talk's going to stop now, but when you look at some of the great sports venues and entertainment venues in the world, the MCG is one of the largest and one of the best in the world. But you reflect upon the history of other sporting venues, and I just put up the Colosseum, and of all sporting venues, architecturally and engineering-wise, that I think is probably the best that's around. Why do I say that? When you look at the playing area, the Colosseum's bigger, the playing area is bigger, the height of the stands is bigger. This is 48 metres, and note that it's got 4 tiers with arches. And in terms of the versatility, it had underground facilities for the animals. It had lifts taking it up, and at one stage they diverted the Tiber, filled it with water, and had water sports on it. The MCG is fantastic, but gee whiz, the Colosseum was just extraordinary. These Roman engineers, is Alan Thompson here yet? Oh, he'd love this. Anyway, he's a civil engineer too. The engineering to do with all of this technology is fantastic, but the Colosseum is just most extraordinary. Thank you very much.
Well done, Colin.
Colin, this is a minor point of interest. I listened to a podcast called The Rest is Politics, and one of the guys, it's English, one of the guys who presents it is a sports tragic, and he goes all around the world, and he said that the statues around Melbourne Cricket Ground, you know, Lily and Vaughan, are the best in the world.
That's fantastic.
Can I ask you a question,
Yep.
Colin? You see it overseas, say Wembley Soccer Stadium as well. You know the alternating dark green, light green lines across the ground?
Yep.
Is there an explanation for that? Do you know?
I'll go back to the picture and we can look at it a bit more closely. Okay, that's the sort of thing you're referring to?
Yes. Just wonder how they do it.
I had thought, and that it was the way in which the grass was cut, and left a certain light in the grass when it had been cut, but others would have probably a better opinion than me.
I think it's a roller at the back of the cutter.
Okay. And it's causing the grass to lay a certain way? So the reflection of the light is different?
Yes.
Yep, okay. That's probably it.
Okay, great.
It's interesting when you look at this picture. There's obviously synthetic grass here, but this part here, it's not that it's worn out, but it seems grass doesn't grow as well there. I don't quite know why that is.
That's on the lip of the artificial grass as well.
Yes, that's true, but here's the artificial grass lip there. It might just be different bits of watering and that sort of thing. But a lot of this has been recently laid down again.
Yeah.
Because when Taylor Swift was there, they redid the whole of the grass. They did it in 5 days or something. It's just amazing. Grass technology is a new area.
Yeah. Anyway.
Is it true that during the Second World War it was used as a hospital?
It was used by the Americans as a base. Accommodation.
Underneath?
Well, in the grandstands.
Yeah. They used to sleep in the stands.
Yeah.
Anything else? I'm off the hook. Okay.
Off the hook. Well done, Colin.
Well done,
Yeah.
Colin.
Very well done. I think that brings us to sing time.
Oh, sing along. Oh, yes. Sing along. Kevin, our nightingale.
We've got over the screen up there.
Oh, yes, we can. One second. Let's do this. I'll do this. And I'll do this. Hang on. Here we are. There's something. We're going to tuck you in. Pop this in your pants.
On the books?
Sorry.
Is that working?
You can go
Yes.
If it's not loud enough, you just move the headpiece around it.
We thought we were going to sing 3 songs today, and we thought because yesterday was Remembrance Day, that we'd have a bit of a award on the connection to what we're doing. The book's been handed out. Right, I'm trying to get out of that one.
How's that?
Right. You got 2.
First one we're going to sing is number 37.
Can you put that on? Give it to Kevin.
36, Back Up the Troubles.
Yep. 36.
Well, are you ready?
Not quite. Not quite.
Now you're ready.
30, number 36, Will.
Something comes going down.
36.
I don't know what it is.
That's my focus. Okay.
You're all 49.
Troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you're looking like your fag, smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So, back up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. Now, by coincidence, the next song we're going to sing has received some, in a sense, publicity yesterday, and again to do with war. A private, Richard Norton, received a posthumous VC yesterday for action in Vietnam. And where does he come from? He comes from where we're going to sing the next song. He comes from Gundagai, number 37.
Something's gone crazy with It's like,
There's the track winding back to an old-fashioned shack along the road to Gundagai, where the blue gums are growing, the Murrumbidgee flowing beneath the sunny sky, where my daddy and mother are waiting for me, and the bells of my childhood once more I will see. Then no more will I roam when I'm headed right for home, along the road to Gundagai. We're going to finish with one to do with the Second World War. Number 48.
48, Will.
The White Cliffs.
Yeah, that's yours. That's Will's. That's Will's. That's that.
Encourage the people. You should have had the last post.
Yes. When crossing on the ferry for. Very white. Yeah, depending on how the sun's shining. Trying to get there.
Have you been there, Will? Dover? You been there? White Cliffs of Dover?
Once, yeah.
Yeah.
There they are.
I'm told we don't need this at all, so we just turn it off. That's good, isn't
I think we're right to go, Nick.
We get it wired up.
Yeah, we come down
Yeah. Can you give rules where it's got? Yeah. Yeah.
Parliament House.
Okay. Bruce?
Yeah.
Nick just told me that Alan's happy to record. We're up to that.
How are you? Good to see you.
Well, no, I don't believe so, no.
This is Will's one.
Yes. Yeah, just put it, Alan's just got to put it on.
Yeah, okay, we'll do that.
That's right. Yeah, sure.
It's not going to be visually recorded. It's not different. What do you want to see?
I think I don't need a mic. I think you can all hear me. The topic today by our Speaker Alan Thompson is John Monash, his achievements and his complicated personal life, and a little bit about World War One. By way of background, Alan grew up in Rosanna. His family lived in Lower Plenty Road, not far from here. Most of you met Alan last year when he spoke to us about the Australian Parliament and his role, which was in charge of ancillary facilities. Alan is an engineer, and so we talked a lot of that about how it worked, but also the challenges he had with upgrading their IT system. I knew Alan when he was Secretary of the Department of Justice here in Victoria in the 1990s, and he was a very well-regarded leader and manager. So please welcome Alan Thompson.
I'm a bit late.
Real question.
You all fix well.
Yeah, I need to be in field for this camera, do I? Yeah.
Alan Thompson.
Yeah. Yeah, you just need to get.
Are you going to stand at the lectern?
Well, I prefer to bring the
We
lecture
can-
forward, so I
You don't
can.
need
Yes,
electric, you'll need
well,
this.
we can do that, but if you can stand there,
Just need to get
we
the
can,
camera.
I can move the camera to get you
Okay,
at the
good,
lectern.
yeah, okay. Just as long as I'm audible to everybody.
That,
A little bit deaf, and if we want deaf,
Right.
we'll put this in your hands.
So,
If I go to the wrong spots here, he's talking with a higher voice now, so I must have done something to it.
yeah, that's okay.
That's okay. Can you hear me? Am I audible at the back there? Good.
Okay, you.
Yeah.
What you're doing for?
Yes. No, okay. So just,
Sure.
there's a few photos I want to use, and a couple of books actually. So I could order them.
you want to talk this board over?
So, that'll be fine.
You're right, okay.
Bit of a script here. Can I just fold up this?
Yeah.
So I fold it up or great making. Well, look, thank you very much for a kind welcome. I'll be held firmly to account now because my ex-Bible studies teacher is sitting in your front row, Keith Tupper.
Hey.
So how are you, Keith? I haven't seen you for a while. Okay. Now, am I audible now?
Yep.
Great. Okay. And yes, last time I was here it was a discussion about Parliament House, Canberra, and the dramas there, or the dramas stroke melodramas keep on unfolding there. And I guess we'll wait and see what happens probably early next year now for a new federal election. The talk today will be about John Monash. By, I suppose, happenstance, we're talking one day after Armistice Day, and in fact a very significant Armistice Day because in November the 11th, 1934, our Shrine of Remembrance opened, and it was a big deal on the day. Did anybody see any of the footage on the TV yesterday about it? Yeah, don't worry if you didn't, not a big deal. But in just getting ready for today, I did a bit of research because I knew it was 90 years ago that the shrine had finally opened, and I found this photo. Now, I'm not going to use any of that. I'll be handing around these various photos, but this one is a good opening stanza. It was the shrine on November the 11th, 1934, and there were a modest 300,000 people there. So it's a very big deal, and I'll just start handing these around. Just once you've all seen it, just drop them on a table at the back, and I'll collect them then. So the subject today is John Monash, who was by far our most famous military guy. And I will touch briefly on his military achievements, but the bigger deal for me is his achievements as an engineer, especially around Victoria, and his complicated personal life. Be in no doubt this was really complicated. But here's a nice photograph of John, just to set a bit of a scene, a portrait that was done just at the peak of his powers. He would have been around 55 years old then. He didn't live a long life, he lived to age 66, so that's 11 years before he died. In terms of my knowledge about John Monash, I guess I'll group it in three. Firstly, I had a grandfather, I had two grandfathers, but the one I spent a lot of time with was Walter Atkins from Brunswick, and he'd been a vicar's gunner serving under John Monash on the Western Front. So while I was helping Walter repair cricket bats, he would tell me bits and pieces about his time at Villas, at Wipers, at Plug Street, which are all names of battlefields around the Western Front. That was my first encounter with John Monash, and I might say Walter was very grateful because, as he said, if the war had gone on beyond November 1918, he would have been dead and I would not have been alive. It was as blunt as that he could just see his mates being killed every battle, yet another lot of his mates dying, and he had no expectation about living into 1919. So that was encounter one with John Monash. The second encounter was that I went to McLeod High School and then went to Melbourne University Engineering School, and the engineering faculty were absolutely thrilled that Victoria's second university had been named after one of their graduates, John Monash, who graduated in the 1890s. My third encounter with John Monash was 25 years later, or thereabouts, out riding. I was living in Mont Albert. A group of us were riding around the Outer Circle railway line. People know what I'm talking about there? Yeah. Mostly it's become a charming place for bike riding through the eastern suburbs, underpasses, overpasses. And one of our number on that bike ride was a history teacher, and we stopped for coffee, and he talked about his understanding about John Monash. The young John Monash, he said, had been the engineer in charge of the Outer Circle Railway, and he'd built it very well over about 5 years. Yeah, and in addition, and this is where it got interesting, he said, of course, this project was where John had his first great romance, and that was with Annie Gabriel. And we all said, who's Annie? And it turns out Annie was his age. Is that echoing too much for you?
No, it's okay.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so John had this raging affair with Annie Gabriel, which was grossly, there were big objections, not from John or Annie, they were in love with each other, but John's two sisters objected because she was Gentile and he was Jewish. That was one problem. And the bigger problem was probably Fred, the work supervisor, a big guy who objected mightily to his wife having an affair with anybody, and it finally terminated in a punch-up at South Yarra Station, where John came off the worst, and Fred and Annie departed for Sydney. And you might think that would be the end of it, but in fact, there's lots of letters over the next 40 years, clear evidence that John and Annie stayed very good friends for a long, long time after that brief encounter, brief altercation at South Yarra Station. So that were my introductions to the life and times of this interesting character called John Monash. The other thing that history teacher, the other point he made was that Monash was a really interesting case study in all of the challenges in being a European immigrant to Australia in the 1800s. Not to Australia, to the Victorian colony. We weren't even a country then. So it was a big challenge for him being a European immigrant from an area of Europe called Prussia, which is now part of Western Poland, and also of being Jewish and all of the anti-Semitism. So again, my interest kicked off from there. In terms of me learning a lot more, there's three really good books. I'm not going to bore you and ask you to read them or test you out, but a really good read is a thing by Roland Perry, which deals with his civilian life and with his time during World War I. And that was published maybe 15, 20 years ago. A much more recent thing by a journalist, Grantley Keyser, is also a good read, a bit slimmer. And the reason I'd say it's worth reading is that there's a lot more from Monash's personal diaries and his personal relationships. The other one's more about the war and so on. Whereas this one, you get a lot about Monash's personal interactions. So they're both a good read, and they're both still on sale in a good bookshop near where you live, I guess. So, yeah. Now, I suppose before we go further with Monash, just to say, in summary, what you get out of these books is there's 5 things about John Monash. Firstly, he was somebody with immense talent. He was immense talent, and he overcame a lot of social disadvantage. That's number one. Number two, he was a workaholic, and he worked basically through until the day before he died. He was lying there on death's bed in 1931, and he was still convening meetings around his bed and issuing orders and writing minutes up until 24 hours before he died. Thirdly, he did make this huge contribution to our infrastructure, not just the electricity system, but a lot of other things as well. Fourthly, he was a shameless self-promoter. He was very, very effective at getting his name in the paper on a regular basis, and that did contribute to his success. He had a very clever technique for that during the war, which I'll come back to. And fifthly, he did have this complicated personal life. So I'll try and run through a lot of that in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Young John is a photo of him as a teenager. But his mum and dad were Prussian Jews. They'd emigrated to the colony of Victoria in 1860, and the dad ran importing businesses and shops in Melbourne. And in 1865, John was born. He was the eldest of 3 kids. So 1865, he came into the world, and in the late 1860s, Victoria actually had a bit of a mini recession. The dad's business went bust, and he had to do something else. So the family decamped from Melbourne and went to live in Jerilderie in southern New South Wales. People know where Jerilderie is. If you're driving up to Queensland, you go through it. So John's early schooling was in Jerilderie, where the dad ran a shop. And he was a brilliant scholar at this school, and it was a single teacher school, and the teacher was in awe that this kid could play music, had 3 languages, could do maths, and an excellent writer as well. So that was that side. Monash had a good time, not least because, as he said, he met Ned Kelly. And for a little kid to meet a bushranger was quite a big deal. So that was Jerilderie. Because he'd been so good at school there, the teacher recommended to his mum and dad they look around for scholarships. And young John got a scholarship to go to Scotch College here in Melbourne. Now in that era, the early 1870s, Scotch was actually based in East Melbourne, not over in Hawthorn where it is now. John went there, and again he did really well going through the high school years at Scotch College. And again, there was much, there was great. People were very impressed at how effective he was. That allowed him to sit for his matric exams early. So at age 16, he had an entry to a university, and the only one in Melbourne was the new Melbourne University. He enrolled in arts and engineering, and off he went to Melbourne Uni. And I must say, a lot of what we know about Monash is because he wrote, from age 13 onwards, he wrote diaries. And they weren't just, went to school. There was lots of detail about what he was thinking at the time, whether he had a good drink last night, whether he'd met some girl last night. So we do have a lot of information from when he was 13 onwards. And coming out of those early teenage diaries, there were 3 things I'll quote to you. Number 1, he sincerely wanted to become, quote, famous and admired. So there was an ambition there for this young guy. He wanted to be recognised. The second was there's numerous examples of flirtatious affairs with both Jewish girls and Gentile girls. He wasn't a lone ranger. There was lots of different girls there. And the third bit, which probably contributed to his early-ish death, there was a lot of writing about smoking and drinking. So that was all in his teenage diaries. In 1884, another big thing happened. He was at uni, but he took this quite momentous decision to join a thing called the Melbourne University Company of the Victorian Rifles. Now the Victorian Rifles was like a reserve Victorian regiment of the British Army. So here we were still a colony, but they'd formed this, the state of Victoria had formed this reserve company, and Melbourne University had a platoon, if you like, in that. Now, from Monash's viewpoint, he probably joined it partly out of patriotism because of the great fear in the 1880s about Russia, and whether we'd be invaded or bombarded by this other empire, Russia. But it'd be fair to say the other reason he joined, of course, was for a young Jewish boy, this was a good way into Victorian society through the Army Reserve. So he joined in 1884, and hold this, just remember, he then stayed in reserve as a reserve soldier right through to 1914 when he became a regular. So this wasn't a 2-year affair or anything with the Army, this was the next 30 years. He was there initially as a non-commissioned officer, progressed up to officer rank and so on, all over that 30 years. Okay, in 1885, he's studying at Melbourne, but the family business was going bad again. and he felt the need to get a job just to support the whole family. So he threw his hat into the ring to become an assistant engineer on Prince's Bridge. Now, a bit of history there. I hadn't realised that Prince's Bridge, as an extension of Swanston Street, the first version was built in 1850. It was a narrow gutted thing. By the 1880s, they decided to build a big, wide bridge. So John became an assistant engineer on that job, worked there in between university studies, and excelled. He did very well. So 3 years later, the economy of Victoria was still going well in the late 1880s. A promoter decided to build an outer circle railway. And he looked around for a talented guy to be the engineer on that. So amazingly, he picked this 23-year-old John Monash to be the engineer on the outer circle. Monash still did not have his degree. He was still studying, but he clearly had huge energy. And so off he went, still doing his part-time studies, but he became the engineer on this outer circle. And just to anchor you firmly, it started in Fairfield, down across what became the Channel Highway Bridge when it fell in a heap, out through Kew and Canterbury, down the line of the Alamein train line, and finally joined the Dandenong line down around Oakley. And that was to be built by this team, where Monash was the engineer and Fred Gabriel was the work supervisor. The head office, if you like, for the project was in Hartwell, and if you think about Toorak Road, heading out with the tram in it, and there's a railway overbridge in this little suburb of Hartwell. That's where the project office was. It was actually a suburban house. John, as the engineer, occupied the front rooms. The back rooms were occupied by Fred and Annie. That's where they lived. And each day Fred would go out foolishly to supervise the teams, digging works, fields, bridges and all that, while John was doing all the comps, and in between his relationship with Annie blossomed big time. And he was absolutely besotted, but in the end, after a couple of years, it ended with this biffer armour at South Yarra Station. But it does add colour and movement to this otherwise very dour engineer to realise that he had this huge affair. Just finishing off on that project, it was finally commissioned in 1892, but by 1892 Victoria was in a depression, almost as bad as the Great Depression in 1928. It was awful. And so this commercial project of having a railway line fell in a heap. And it only ran for about 5 years, and then it all shut up. And it was recreated as a goods line from Fairfield down to this paper mill, run by APM. And then the other bit that was re-established was the Alamein train line as a suburban line. But yeah, it was successfully built by John, but it did fall in a heap commercially. While that was all happening, and after Annie had departed for Sydney, John's sisters did find him a suitable Jewish girl to marry. She was Victoria Moss, from a very affluent family, and they married in 1891, and they had a child a bit later. Her name was Bertha, named after John's very talented mother, who died a few years before. The relationship between Vic and John was stormy, to say the least. And there are 4 reasons for that. And this is me as an engineer, I can speak with this with great authority. Vic had 0 interest in his work. Now I can tell you, it goes down very badly for a young engineer proud of his work on Prince's Bridge and outer circles to have a wife who had no interest. Secondly, it was a depression. Times were very tough. There was no money around, and John certainly didn't have much, but Vic just kept on spending. She expected to have servants and all sorts of things, and he had almost no money. And the other reality was that there were a lot of other women around Melbourne with a lot of interest in John. And one of them, you've got to hold this name in your mind, Lizzie Bentwich. Now, Lizzie had been a friend of Victoria's, but Lizzie was also besotted by John, and there was obviously some affair happening there, which only really, or chapter one of it only terminated in 1898 when she headed off back to London. Okay, so she left in 1898, and I suppose Victoria thought, phew, got rid of that one. In terms of John, he did get his engineering degree in 1893. Had a lot of trouble earning money as an engineer, but he was very good on his feet. So he made enough money through the rest of this awful depression as an expert witness in courts, dealing with various bridges and so on that had fallen down, or commercial deals that had fallen over, and also as an arbitrator, because he really was very good at talking to people and commanding facts. So they survived through the 1890s on his money earning from those sort of things until the economy recovered basically around 1900. And at that stage, Australia, well, not just Victoria, Australia's prosperity resumed, and life got a lot better for the Monashes and for most of the rest of our forebears who were here. And it'd be fair to say, what I'd neglect to do is photo of Annie, good looking, and photo of John and Victoria. I didn't mean to pass those around. About the time of the economy was recovering, Monash did a clever thing. He got the Australian rights to a process of manufacturing reinforced concrete using what's called the Monia process. Now, dumb Alan, I thought Monia was named after John Monash. Wrong. Monia was a Frenchman who worked out how to build steel reinforcing into concrete. So by chance, this young John Monash here grabbed the rights to this technology and prospered greatly by building lots of things around Australia and around Victoria. One of the nicest things that he did using this technology is the Morell Bridge. Now, anybody remember where the Botanic Gardens are? Yeah. And a bridge nearby, a narrowish bridge, beautifully built, called the Morell Bridge, or sometimes it's called the Anderson Street Bridge. Yeah. So that was one of their early works, but there was lots of other ones as well. So 1900 on for the next 13 years, Monash and Vic prospered. The business was going well, money was rolling in. They bought a Toorak mansion called Iona and a newfangled French car. It wasn't a Renault, I can't think what brand it was. John became very active in Melbourne's learned societies and charities. They had a grand overseas tour in the late about 1908 through the UK, USA and Germany. And of course John, he understood German, so he was able to better understand the way Germany was expanding and getting more aggressive and was willing to take on France and the United Kingdom and try and be a world power. So he was very worried. In parallel with all of that, he put on a lot of weight. So he went from being a slim young guy to a guy, this one, he was about 40, about 48, I guess. But here he was, he looks a lot paunchier. And I guess that's just a function of prosperity. At that time that you put on weight and you look prosperous and all of that. But at the same time, as he was doing all that, he was still busy in the Army Reserve. But it moved from being a British Army Reserve to being the Australian Army. He was still active. I think they called it the North Melbourne Rifles, that he was part of. And because he was a businessman, he understood how power worked. And each time a British general would come out, he would befriend that general. So before the war, he'd met and befriended Lord Kitchener, who was the chief of all Britain's armies and navies, and he'd also befriended a guy called Ian Hamilton, and we've all heard his name. He was the failed general at Gallipoli. He was the guy who didn't quite deliver Gallipoli how it was. But nevertheless, there was a reality that Monash, go-getter and forceful, confident, had actually befriended them as people before World War 1914, the war broke out. It'd be fair to say Monash was 49 years old and prosperous. He didn't have to go to war, but he did. He flipped over from being a reservist. He put his hand up and he stepped out of his private life with his companies, and he actually took a commission in the full-time army. And I won't go through all of the detail of that, but it'd be fair to say over the next 5 years he was initially our chief censor for a few months, and that was partly because he spoke German. Then he became the commander of the second convoy. This was the second AIF convoy taking our troops across to Egypt and the Middle East. Then he was a mid-level brigadier general at Gallipoli. He wasn't always on the front line, but he was there, and there was death and mayhem around, and he was seen to acquit himself well, not brilliantly, but well. And then when Gallipoli was evacuated, he had his 3 years on the Western Front, and that's where his organising skills became more and more clear, not just to the Australian Army, but to the British Army and the British government. And so he kept on getting ratcheted up from being a brigadier general to a major general to being a lieutenant general. And when he was a lieutenant general level, he was then in charge of all of Australia's armed forces on the Western Front. This was, be fair to say, this was with much opposition from our Prime Minister of the day, who was Billy Hughes. Billy Hughes hated having anybody who had more profile than him. Oh yeah, so there was no love lost between John Monash and Billy Hughes. The three big battles that Monash triumphed were all in 1918. From what I can check of my grandfather's time, he was involved in 3 of them at Hamel, which is about July, and then Amiens or Villers-Bretonneux in August, and then Mont-Saint-Quentin in August. And I've certainly got some verbal feedback from my grandfather all those years ago, but each time you read the history books, they were a triumph because Monash and his equivalent from Canada began to understand how you integrate tanks into tackling trench warfare. And be fair to say, they worked out a way where you have bombardment from artillery, then you have the tanks go out in the lead and the infantry come in behind, essentially hide behind the tanks as the tanks are making their progress across the landscape. And that meant instead of having battles where you might regard as a tremendous win to advance 100 metres, on August the 8th, at the Battle of Amiens, they advanced 5 kilometres in one day. And that was my grandfather telling me that, but that's what history books say as well. This was all about having the tanks in the lead, and the tanks would they'd do a relay race, essentially, where some tanks would go ahead, then they'd have to stop and refuel, others would go ahead, and the young soldier boys with their machine guns and so on would come in behind and made enormous progress leading to the rapid end of the war in 1918. Monash, through that time, was immensely successful with his troops. He was also got pretty good press coverage here, although it was very uneven. Our official biographer of the war, or official historian, was Charles Bean, and he had no time for this pushy Jew. So his reports back here were bad. Also, be fair to say, a fellow called Keith Murdoch, Rupert's dad, didn't have much time for Monash because he wanted another Australian general to be the lead, a fellow called Brudenell White, who may have been a good general, I don't know. But at least Keith Murdoch wasn't anti-Semitic, whereas Bean was. Against that, John, a bit of enterprise here. What you do is you're just behind the battlefield, you've got a secretary to type stuff up. So you type up these scripts, and they're all neatly done. And the script would read, the wise and prudent leadership of Lieutenant General John Monash and the gallant performance of his troops led to a huge triumph here or there or there. They'd then go in envelopes and be sent home on express express ships that land in Victoria's letterbox in Iona, and she enjoyed going in to see various newspaper editors. And she got on well with all Melbourne's. Melbourne was the capital of the country at that stage, so she knew the editor of the Age, the Argus, the Herald, the Sun. She'd take their scripts in, and these editors loved having success. So the overall press coverage of John Monash in the Melbourne, and there was no radio, it was all about print media, that more than outweighed the negative from Charles Bean. People read with huge pride that their young soldier boys, Ramian or Hamel, had triumphed. And this was all courtesy of this clever way of getting around the censors and overcoming the anti-stuff out of Charles Bean. Also worth saying that during his time on the Western Front, which is not that far away from London, he'd get leave, not often, but each time he'd go across to London for a week's leave, who was waiting for him in London but Lizzie Bentwich. So this affair out of the 1890s rekindled, and they were highly visible all around London. And there was no question about is Sir John married, is there a wife somewhere? It was just John, it was General Monash and his partner, Miss Bentwich, met the Queen, or met the King, you know, and Monash got on well with George V, but that was the scene in London. While back here, Victoria was doing his bidding, feeding the newspaper editors with the scripts. 1918, November the 11th, armistice was declared, and of course thereafter all the troops began the process of wanting to come home. Billy Hughes didn't want Monash to come home because he was worried about Monash being too popular and taking over his job. So he gave Monash another job, which is, you've been successful on the battlefield, now I want you, John Monash, to organise the repatriation of our troops, which Monash did. It was a tough thing to do because by then the Spanish flu was around, and organising troop ships and trying to find ways of getting these young guys home. And some of the stories are not great. One of my other grandfather, he was certainly stuck in Port Phillip Bay for about 6 to 8 weeks because his ship had Spanish flu. And so they were in Port Phillip Bay. They could see Port Melbourne, but they weren't allowed to come ashore until the Spanish flu had worked its evil punishment on these young guys. And a lot of them did die at sea. It'd be fair to say the way the officers on those ships maintained order was simply to ply all of the troops with beer. And that left that grandfather of mine with a serious alcohol problem for the rest of his life. But at least he did come back ashore. In parallel with that, in parallel with all of that, John's wife, Vic, and his daughter Bertha did go over to London. They did meet John, and just by chance, her long-time friend Lizzie was there as well. That was amazing, wasn't it? But Vic and Bertha were able to share with some of the joy of early 1919, and then they all, John, Vic and Bertha all came back to a hero's welcome in late 1919. Interestingly, they came on ship, of course. The ship came into Port Phillip Bay, and they then disembarked on a launch and came off at St Kilda Pier, rather than Station Pier. Came off at St Kilda Pier, and then there was a hero's drive up to Government House, where the governor of the day, and that was the Governor General, because we were the national capital then. The Governor General welcomed Sir John back, and then Monash and his family went back to live in Iona, and he started to resume a civilian life. Now that civilian life, he had hopes it would involve something at the federal government level, but it never did. Billy Hughes was never ever going to offer John Monash anything, but offsetting that, the Victorian government did. They promptly offered him the chairmanship of this new thing called the State Electricity Commission with a handsome salary, and he said for the next 10 years that was his main mission in life, was to give Victoria reliable power, and that involved a new brown coal open cut down at Yallourn, a power station alongside it, transmission lines back to Melbourne, transmission lines all around the rest of Victoria to provide reliable power. And that was his principal preoccupation for the next 10 years. In parallel, the Victorian government also gave him another gig, and that was to be the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University. So through the 20s, he was both VC of Melbourne University and the chair of the SEC. But during that time, early in that time, Vic did die. She'd had a long-run cancer, they couldn't cure it, and she died in 1922, I think it was. And amazingly, about 3 months later, Lizzie re-arrived in Victoria on a ship. Now, it would appear that John thought Lizzie could come and live with them at Iona in Toorak. But daughter Bertha was having none of that. So from there on, for the rest of the 20s, John's life revolved around living at Iona, going to work each day, working really hard, but during the day he'd meet Lizzie, who he was paying to put up at various high-end hotels around Melbourne, and he had a social life with Lizzie, who progressively became Elizabeth, by the way. She stopped being Lizzie, or Lizette, she was Elizabeth, and they had this quite good social life, the races, concerts and all of that, and restaurant meals, while at home he was a good father to Bertha, and he progressively acquired 3 grandchildren. And so he was a very proud grandfather as well. But this was in parallel with this other life with Lizzie in and around the CBD. We're just about at the end of the story now, but also through the 20s, he actually had 3 other really important things he did for Australia. Well, the first was for Victoria, and that was in 1923, there was a police strike, and all the coppers walked. There was a pay dispute, and they all walked off the job. And there was a great fear about criminality, violence, and all that. The Premier asked Sir John to recall some of his soldiers, both officers and sergeant majors and sergeants. And so for about 72 hours, Victoria's policing was provided by General Monash and his and these officers and so on. And that did save a lot of violence and did save a lot of thievery. The second was about this Yallourn power station was going to use brown coal, and the only country in the world that knew about that was Germany. And there was a lot of resistance from a lot of people inviting Germans, who just fought this world war against. But Monash used his prestige to insist that a limited number of the German engineers be allowed to come to Victoria because they had the skill. The third thing was the big battle about whether or not to have a shrine. There were 2 camps. The pro-shrine camp was led by Sir John Monash. The anti was led by Sir Keith Murdoch. Murdoch's view, and I'm not saying there was anything right or wrong, I could see both arguments. The Murdoch view was there is money that ought to be spent on these damaged, returned soldiers. A lot of them were very, very damaged, and I can see that amongst my 2 grandfathers. So Murdoch's view was all that money should be spent on the welfare of these very damaged young men. Against that, the Monash view, and it's just the one that finally prevailed, was we need to remember what happened, and for that we need a substantial monument where we can, each year, we can recognise the sacrifice. And in the end, that view prevailed. So by the latter part of the 20s, it was agreed there would be a shrine, and that was finally built and opened in 1934 after Monash had died. Monash, he was still going strong through 1930, but by 31, he was 66 years old, heart problems, probably driven by smoking and too much eating, and almost certainly also driven a bit by the battlefield life, because even though generals are not in harm's way, he was working enormous hours, 7 days without sleep, that sort of thing, through the various battles. So he kept on working, from his hospital. Well, it wasn't a hospital bed. He died at home. He was cared for at home. And until the day before he died, he was still convening meetings and all of that. But he finally died. He finally died in October 31, age 66. And there was great sadness from all these young soldier boys, very well recognising that if the war had carried on, they would be dead. So they were very grateful. The funeral revolved around a service in a Melbourne synagogue, and then a funeral procession down St Kilda Road. One of my uncles, Wal Atkins Jr., was 8 at the time, and he could easily remember being part of the whole thing. He said there were enormous crowds as Monash's coffin was wheeled past. And then Monash was finally interred down at Brighton Cemetery alongside his wife Vic. And if you ever want to go down to Brighton Cemetery, it's a nice cemetery. It's unlike the Heidelberg one on a steep hill, the Brighton one's on a gentle, got it mostly flat, but with a gentle slope on the east side. And there up on that gentle rise is the graves of John and Vic. And they're clearly marked, it's not hard to find them. So that was the end of his life. In terms of his legacy, obviously the unexpected early end of World War I, because nobody on the Allied side believed it would happen in 1918. They thought it was going to go right into 1919 once the Americans had come over in full force, but it ended early. So that meant people like me are grateful, and a lot of others are grateful because our grandpas were alive. And in my case, yes, my grandfather came back. They both came back. My dad was born in 1921, my mum in 1922. Now, neither of those would have happened, and I dare say there'll be people here with a similar story. So there's that gratitude. There's all the infrastructure around Victoria that we can be grateful for, not just the electricity infrastructure, roads and bridges and so on. There's all the things named after Monash. Monash University, Monash Medical Centre, Monash Freeway, I could go on. The Monash name didn't really continue, not directly, because he only had one child, that was Bertha, and she married Gordon Bennett. So the name you might encounter, and I've met one of these people, there's a number of the offspring, the next generation down, who proudly travel under the name of whatever their Christian name is or the Jewish name is, Monash Bennett. And they're still around Melbourne. There's quite a few of them who are Monash Bennetts, and they will be the offspring, either grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or whatever from John Monash. The other little legacy that he left was that the tactics that Monash and Arthur Curry from Canada adopted, using the tanks as the spearhead for the infantry, were studied with great interest by an entity called the Wehrmacht, the German Wehrmacht, in the 1930s, and became the template for how they ran their blitzkrieg at the beginning of 1939. Be also fair to say there was another American general who also studied them with great interest, and his name, of course, was George Patton. And Patton used the same tactics with the American invasion of Sicily, and then Sicily, and then Italy, and then the Normandy invasion. Patton's tactics were very similar to the blitzkrieg and all modelled on the Monash system. Okay, that's what I'm going to end my talk. Happy to answer any questions. There's one or two other, just before I felt any questions, another couple of photos. Just hand them around. There's an imperfect photo of the original Yallourn power station, now been demolished. Here's John and family with Lizette on one side. there's John and Lizette in the 20s, and here's John Monash probably within a matter of a few months of him dying as Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University. Okay, I haven't spoken for too long.
Oh, terrific.
Fantastic. Take questions.
The RSL, that was initiated by John Monash too, was it not?
I think it wasn't just Monash. There were a lot of other people could see the benefit of that. They used his name often because he had so much credibility. But it'd be fair to say that was not opposed by people like Keith Murdoch or whatever. So a lot of people wanted something like that, and it's flourished ever since. Yeah.
Helen, you mentioned his name. Now I understand he dropped the C from his name at some point to get away from the German connotation.
Yeah.
When did he do that?
It's a good question. So far as the books say, it actually happened about 1863, before he was born. The mum and dad were very keen to move out of being seen as Prussian Jews, so they actually appear to have done it before young John was born. So he was always M-O-N-A-S-H. Also, it is relevant to say that he was born Jewish, but he was never a practicing, active attender of synagogues or anything like that. The fact that he was buried via a synagogue service is almost accidental. He obviously had his various affairs with Gentile women, and he mixed freely in all society, and was used occasionally by the Jewish community to advocate for them, but he certainly was not a regular attender of Jewish religious services.
Did he have anything to do with officer training prior to the First World War?
Not really. The officer training for the army had moved already to Duntroon, which is really right on the edge of Canberra. I don't think he would have ever been there until the 20s. It was a very little isolated thing up there, and to be right through the 1900s through to 1913, from what I could see, he was 90% preoccupied by running his business here in Melbourne, and 10% committed to being a reserve soldier fellow. After the war, he would have been somebody who would have regularly supported things like officer training, but because that was a Commonwealth responsibility, he would not have got. Billy Hughes wouldn't have tolerated him at all. He was persona non grata to Billy Hughes.
When was he knighted?
Good question. He was knighted by King George on the battlefield in 1918. An interesting little point worth reflecting on, and Monash made this connection. A clever guy. His part of the AIF came to the battlefields via Salisbury Plain in England, and there was a big parade down there, and King George V was there, and Monash worked out. George V, born in 1865, of German parents. So they befriended each other from that point. And they both had a lot of trouble through World War I, because there was a nasty undercurrent that there were these Germans who were a fifth column on the British side. And George V copped it, along with Monash, quite nasty stuff. So they knew each other, because he was a guy from German stock who was on the Allied side, along with the King. And so apparently George essentially did it himself. He saw the Battle of Amiens as a huge triumph. It reversed the tidal wave of German advances. And so he grabbed the chance to give a knighthood to John Monash, and also to the Canadian, who was an equivalent. These guys were both reservists, by the way. Monash, an engineer from Australia, Arthur Curry, a real estate agent from Vancouver, or Vancouver Island. But those were the two who reversed it from being a progressive retreat in front of the Germans to the reverse. So they both got battlefield knighthoods.
Alan, did the Melbourne University Regiment, was that a sort of follow-on to what Monash was involved in when he was at Monash?
That's my understanding, is that, before Federation, it was called, it was something of the Victoria Rifles, and then once, I assume it carried on, because Monash's reserve commitment was through the North Melbourne. Once Federation had happened, he was involved in what was called the North Melbourne Rifles, I think. But then, certainly once he became Vice-Chancellor, I'll guarantee he would have reinvigorated the Melbourne University Regiment. And somewhere in there, it was reincarnated as a regiment rather than whatever it had been of the Victoria Rifles. So, I've talked for too long, so I apologise for that.
It's only because you're interested, Alan.
Yeah.
You captured our interest.
Yeah.
Did he face 87 years in the claw? And if so, how did he handle it?
He faced a heap of it, shoulder loads of it. That was both before Federation, when Victoria was just a colony, and afterwards, and then especially through World War I. And his approach was basically to have himself and his family well integrated into the community. And I think it might be a tactic the Jewish community now needs to, because it's under a lot of attack again. But the John Monash approach was very much about being part of Victoria, part of Australia, rather than being somebody stand out and separate. That seemed to be the way he mostly coped. Yeah. After that.
Is Iona still there?
Yeah.
Is Iona?
I understand no. No, I gather it's been bowled over and a new McMansion's been built there. That's certainly, I think it might be the Keyser book that says it's been demolished. Yeah. I mean, interesting that there wasn't much interest in his life or the things around him until the 1980s. And at that stage, another historian, a guy called Geoffrey Searle, wrote a really good, thick book that I would also recommend you read if you can find a copy somewhere. At that stage, people began to think, oh, we ought to preserve a bit more about John Monash, because even though his name was on things, his history had not been preserved until then. So my understanding is that I only got bowled over maybe in the 70s. Yeah. No? Okay, no.
So, as an ex-Monash student, I'm just wondering why they called Monash University Monash.
Well, I mean, at the time, I guess if you thought back to the late 1950s, there was a clearly already New South Wales had a second university, UNSW, and Victoria was going to have one. And I assume that the government of the day, which would have been probably the Balti government, they needed a name for a second university that would be popular. And what I can say is that back then, and that's in the era when my grandparents were in their 60s and 70s, that would have been enormously popular to have their general as the name of the new university. Because essentially that decision would have been taken very early on in the life of that campus down at South Clayton. And that roughly, I know if you take my mum's family, those grandparents were in their 60s at that stage, and that would have been number one. Who would you have? They wouldn't have had tolerated being a local politician, but I would have John Monash. Yeah.
One of the secretaries just reminded me that apparently Sir John Monash was a patent lawyer.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with that?
Yes, he
non-practicing.
Yeah.
He did some court cases.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, he through the he graduated as an engineer, but then he progressively acquired a couple of other degrees, and he certainly acquired court skills, and he was canny about ways of wealth creation, and he realised that patents were one option, and especially around the Monier system for reinforcing steel was something he brought in from elsewhere, paid money for it, but he would have been keen to protect the rights of his companies. He was clever, got on his feet in court, so yes, it'd be fair to say the other thing to understand about his life, there was really a typical week, he worked the whole week. Monday to Saturday, Monday through to Saturday morning would have been at work wherever, Then he might have taken a little bit of time off Saturday afternoon. Sunday morning, it's recorded in his books, was when he did his personal accounts, the home finances for Iona and so on. And then Sunday afternoon was when he allocated that to the grandchildren. He was a home hobbyist. He'd help them to make little houses and so on in his workshop at Iona. So he was never still, and some of that time, I'll guarantee, he would have worked out about becoming having some skills in patents and so on. He was a very driven fellow. Yeah. I think we're about the end of it.
I think so.
Good. Oh, thank you very much.
Please accept this on behalf of the club for coming along today. You've been before in this presentation today. You put a lot into it. Excellent presentation and excellent to all of us here. It's terrific. I didn't know a lot about John Monash. I've travelled overseas in the last few years and taken up a little bit about him. In recent times, read about his victories in July, August 1918. But it's lamentable when I think about it. I finished school in 1971, and one of the last subjects that I did at school was Australian history. I don't remember learning anything about Sir John Monash. But what a clever man, and what an Australian. But anyway, thanks again, Al. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Would you rescue the
Microphone.
Oh, yes, you've got to get this mic off.
On the end, though.
It's very cool.